Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris. We are on pages 71 to 93 of Man's Search for Meaning. And these are the last pages of the first chapter, Experiences in a Concentration Camp. And then after this, we move on to the second chapter, Logotherapy in a Nutshell. These last pages are interesting in that Viktor, it's less autobiographical. Now he's starting to get more into like the theory that kind of, I'm assuming, sets up for what logotherapy in a nutshell is. So you're going to see less stories, right? And not as many like personal experiences. Like he kind of uses that to give examples of his theories. So I just thought that was interesting. The tone kind of changed. And I think that's the reason why it changes to set up for the second chapter. But a lot of interesting topics are brought up in here about time, suffering, meaning, and how those kind of all relate together. We're going to start off with this thing about time on page 71 and how last time in the discussion we talked about how time becomes deformed for these camp members, for the prisoners, in kind of a similar way how it becomes deformed for unemployed minors that Viktor talks about on page 70, in that you don't know the end of your prison sentence. It's limitless. So time becomes like an infinite thing to you. And without that goal in your life, the future goal, things just really seem like they have no end. And Viktor talks about how in camp, like a day could last forever, but then a week seemed to go by super, super fast. So this notion of time and the future has its relation in that if you don't have a goal to look forward to or that you're working towards, then your time is going to be all messed up. Where space comes in is now time expands in the camp because it's hard to deal with the daily atrocities of the camp. And it feels like you no longer have meaning and the suffering is too much. So time expands, but your space narrows. You're confined to your prison. You're not allowed to go outside of that prison. You see the outside world, but you don't even know if it's, like Viktor talks about, like you don't even know if it's real. You don't even know. So it's an interesting dichotomy. Time expanding, space contracting. And like he talks about here on 74, a man declined in camp because he did not have any future goal. He could not see an end in sight. Symptoms of this included, like, when you would wake up in the morning, you notice somebody wasn't getting dressed, they weren't washing, they weren't going out with everybody else outside of the huts. No reaction to being hit or yelled at. If they were sick, they didn't want to go see the doctors. Probably neglected to eat as well. They're mailing it in. They are giving up. These were some of the symptoms he talked about. And then Viktor he gives a story on page 75 about a guy that dreamt. He comes up to him and he says, like, oh, I had a dream that the war would be over by a certain date, This was on page 75. And there was in his dream, I guess he dreamt that March 30th, the war would end. What ended up happening was, as the day drew nearer, the guy actually got sick, and then he died on March 31st of typhus. And Viktor goes on to say, and I wonder, where did I put this? Well, he goes on to say that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. So that the fact that he was so hopeful of this day, and when it was very clear that it wasn't going to happen, they weren't going to be free, and the war wasn't going to be ended, the guy's immunity dropped. And he talks about that on page 75 a little bit, towards the bottom. How the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. Very interesting. Continuing on this subject of time, Viktor talks about the present. The present, it's a gift, and the tendency to look at the past to forget the present. And a lot of people did this, whether it was like daydreaming or in your dreams. And remember how he would talk about this as kind of like dangerous in a way? Like, you don't want to dwell in, and this is in life, just regular life, you don't want to dwell in the past. You don't want to dwell in the past. It's important to look back there, but you don't want to dwell in there because, as Viktor states, there's opportunities in the present. And those opportunities are to make your life meaningful. And you do that through your suffering. So you can grow emotionally, spiritually, physically, whatever. But for those that were stuck in the past, life became meaningless because they were so attached to their life before, they couldn't appreciate those opportunities they had in this moment that could set you up for your future. Right? The future is coming. Right here. It's coming every second. Right? The past isn't coming back. So it's important to realize those opportunities that you have and not dwell in the past. You know, he talks about how in the camp, you know, people thought that the worst was always coming. But he quotes Otto von Bismarck here. Life is like being at the dentist. You always think that the worst is still to come, and yet it is already over. So I get why people would think this in the camp. You want to shield yourself as much as you can, emotionally, physically. So you're always on high alert, saying to yourself, okay, be prepared because tomorrow it's going to be worse. Because of the fact, if you're not mentally preparing for that and you're caught off guard, that could be the line in the sand between life and death. But what Bismarck is saying, no, the worst is over. And if you maybe kind of think about it, I mean, remember the 3 stages of the prisoner's like mental attitude? First part was shock. Second part was apathy. All right. Third part we're going to talk about here today, liberation. So in the first part, you're getting the shock. And that's where maybe you would start to think the worst is yet to come. But in the apathy where you get dulled to camp life, this is where you should start thinking about those opportunities in the present. The opportunities to grow and give meaning to your life. Meaning, not meaningless, meaningful. But nobody, Victor, it's funny, like nobody's saying, I think when people maybe listen to this or read this book and they see opportunity, they think like ease or simple, like a business opportunity, making lots of money. But Victor never says anything about it being easy. Remember in The Matrix when Neo first meets with Morpheus? Or no, excuse me, no. When Neo goes back into the Matrix for the first time with Morpheus, and Morpheus is explaining to him what the Matrix is, and Morpheus shows him a Duracell battery, and he says, this is what life for humans has become while they're in the Matrix. You're just a battery. And Neo kind of freaks out and says, I don't believe it. No. And Morpheus says, I didn't say it'd be easy. All I offered was the truth, but I didn't say it was going to be easy. And that's the thing about the red pill. This side note, it's a bitter, bitter pill to swallow. Bitter, bitter pill to swallow. So, where was I going with this? I didn't say those opportunities are easy to come by. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy to deal with the camp, but they're there if you work for it. If they're there if you want it. I have this slide here from page 73, this Latin phrase, from the perspective of the eternal, subspecie aeternitas. And Victor precedes this sentence by, it is a peculiarity of man that he can only live by looking to the future. Man can only live, but the Latin here means from the perspective of the eternal. This is going to be a discussion question. I should have opened this before. Oh, I am unprepared here. What do you think is the meaning of subspecie aeternitatis? This was on page 73. Because in one way, from the perspective of the eternal, so you might think by looking into the future, you're looking at eternity. What do you think? By looking into the future, you're looking at the opportunities that will be present to you. And you might think in your world here, you have a lot of problems, but from the eternal perspective, life goes on. Maybe something to do with that. Let's explore that later, though. I just thought that was a very interesting passage that he wrote about. Let's go next. Page 74. Spinoza on ethics. There was this quote, more Latin. I didn't write it all here, but it's translated, emotion which is suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. So Victor kind of talks, he brings this up because he talks about a story where things aren't going his way, and he starts thinking about all these thoughts. If he's going to get food, should I trade in my last cigarette for food? And his thoughts are kind of all over the place, it seems like. Which should would I get to our work site in time to join my usual working party, or would I have to join another one? Yada, yada, yada. And then he kind of calms himself down by then thinking about standing in a lecture hall and giving a lecture. All that oppressed me at that moment became objective, seen and described from the remote viewpoint of science. By this method, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the sufferings of the moment, and I observed them as if they were already of the past. So he kind of visualizes himself giving a lecture, and it helps him, get beyond his present suffering about the food or about the work party or whatever. So he's saying how he did that was he put a name to it. And this is something that I've done as well. Like, I remember having some anxiety attacks, and as I grew up and got a little older, they started to become less and less. And I remember having some, and even like today, if I start to get worked up about something, I go right at it and I make a precise picture of it. Like, okay, you're feeling this way for a reason. Why are you feeling this way? Oh yeah, it's because of this. Okay, well, let's go through it. You think this might happen. Let's discuss why you're thinking it. And let's talk about how that is very, very unlikely. And your emotions are running wild on you. Let's look at this a little more rationally. That's kind of how I learned to deal with it. And I think that's how he brings it up here. If you don't want to run away from the suffering, you take it head on. You say, hey, give me that. We're going to paint this picture of it and we're going to talk about it. And I think that helps a lot of people. In life, in the camp, I'm sure it helped a lot of people. This was something we already talked about, the connection between the mind and immunity. Like with the story of the guy with the dream and how he thought the war was going to end. And then when it didn't, he ended up dying March 31st. This was another thing that Viktor brought up, was the death rate increased around Christmas and New Year's. Specifically, he's talking about 1945, between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945. And he was saying how a lot of people thought that they would be home by then. The war would be over, they'd be home with their loved ones, and they still weren't. So that kind of putting all your eggs in that basket to not have it come to fruition, I mean, that steals a lot of energy from you. Mentally, maybe physically, emotionally, because you start preparing energy and just overall attitude for something that you're so sure is going to come. And when it doesn't, then all that stuff goes to waste. Now you're disappointed. Now you're angry. Some emotions take over, and that can wreck your immune system. I mean, just like in the real world, think about how stress, mental fatigue affects your immune system. You work a ton, you're stressed out, you're not in a good place. Your immune system will probably suffer from that. Let's continue on. How do you get over the despair? This was something that we talked about the very first episode, from the foreword or the preface, introduction, whatever, by Harold Kushner. Was the first one. He mentioned that there was this quote: "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how," by Friedrich Nietzsche, philosopher, German, I believe. So this ties back to time and the future and giving meaning to your life. The why is the meaning. And the how, camp life, guards beating you, how you get through that. in Victor brings this up a couple times in these pages, in this latter part of the book. I mean, he's brought it up in other parts of this first chapter too. I think we've discussed them before, but especially now that we're getting towards the end, he's brought this up a lot. The need for that future goal. The need for that future goal. And if you have that future goal, you have that someone that you're surviving camp for, they're going to have a little bit better time. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's going to give you the strength to get through whatever you're going through at that present moment. And Victor talks about this mindset change that people always talk about, what they're trying to get meaning out of life. But he says it's got to shift. You can't expect that from life. It's more what life expects from us. You're looking for meaning from life, but life is looking for meaning out of you. It's kind of an interesting way to put it. Let's pose that as another discussion question. This was on page 77. What do you think Victor meant not expecting things from life, but rather what expected from you? And in a way, life is almost expecting you to suffer a little bit. A little bit. Life expects you to question a little bit. Question your faith. Question if you can get through it. Right? It's expecting that from you. And again, I'm reading from page 77 of towards the top of the page in my edition. He writes, life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. So life gives you these obstacles, and then life expects you to get through those obstacles, to conquer the obstacles that are set for each individual. And this is what Victor talks about, like when people ask what the meaning of life is. That is not a question you should ask, because that is not a universal question, there is no universal answer for it. It differs from man to man. In a way, the meaning of life here, and I wrote here, is, and Victor uses this word again, opportunity. There's an opportunity in the camp. You got to see it. There's an opportunity in the suffering. The meaning of life is for you to solve your suffering. That unique opportunity to solve your suffering. It is not universal. It is up to you. Every man has that. And he talks about this, I think I just mentioned it just a little bit ago, the opportunity in the suffering. The achievement you get from enduring that suffering. And this is what your mind has to change while you're in this camp. You can't be woe is me. I'm trying to find, wow. I know I had it somewhere there. You can't dwell on the past, not live in the present, right? Not let fate decide what you're doing. Not let the Nazis and the prison guards, officers, take that inner freedom from you. You've got to look at it like, hey, I still have the freedom and the opportunity to achieve something from this suffering, to learn something about myself, to establish some moral values, or whatever it is. Talks about the courage to suffer. This was on page 78. It takes courage to suffer. Because again, like that quote, where was it? You take the suffering head on. You paint that precise picture of it. You take it head on. And it's hard. Nobody said it'd be easy. It takes a lot of courage to do that. Let's continue page 81. This was a story he was talking about. Essentially, one of his prison mates did something bad, and I forget what it was. Forgive me. There was a burglar. There were some minor thefts. They decided, hey, you either give up the burglar or we're going to punish all of you. So they said, you know what? We're not giving up the burglar. So as punishment, they had to fast for, they were starved for 3 days, I think. I think it was 3 days. The 2,500 men preferred the fast. And then somebody comes up to him, the senior black warrior, and he talks to him a little bit, to Viktor this is, and he's saying the real reason for their deaths was giving up hope. He maintained that there should be some way of preventing possible future victims from reaching this extreme state. He's talking about how last few days people died, sickness, suicide. And he charges Viktor with giving out some advice to all the people. And they're inside this hut. I believe it's dark. People, I don't know if people really wanted to hear him out in that moment. They've been fasting and such, and Viktor says too, I was not in the mood to give psychological explanations or preach to anybody, but he began. And these are some of the points he talks about. Whoever was alive, you're alive. You're alive. Your life has reason. You still had hope if you were alive. And he brings this up. This was another Nietzsche quote that he cites. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. All right. You're stronger now than you were when you got in. All right. And I know the future seems hopeless, but what you have experienced, no power on earth can take from you. Remember the thing we talked about, being worthy of your sufferings? I mean, shoot, you're here. You're still standing here. Yeah, you're worthy. You've achieved something by making it this far. Nobody can take this experience from you. Nobody can. And now that past that you were so reminiscent of and hoping that you can get out of this, it's being brought into being. Suffer proudly. You be worthy of your sufferings. It's an achievement. And people talk about a meaning of life, but that includes a meaning of death. That's something people don't bring up. There's a meaning to death too. And a lot of, if you listen to other podcasts, Joe Rogan brings on this guy, Graham Hancock, who talks about how like Egyptians had, and other cultures were very, very interested in death. Death was like a journey to them. All right. In life did not end at death. It doesn't end at death. It's just a new game. It's a new playing field that you're going to have to experience. Such as life. So that was something that Viktor brought up that was interesting. Putting a meaning to death as you put a meaning to life as well. And again, you got to suffer proudly. Give your suffering meaning. It's an achievement. It's not something to look down on. Let's continue on. this was something that Viktor brought up in that a question that he gets asked often. He kind of posited that, like, a question that gets asked to him often was, how could the camp guards treat prisoners this way? And he lays out 4 reasons. So some of them were actually just bad people. They got pleasure from humiliating others. Okay, that was some of them. And those people were selected when severe detachment of guards was needed. So, like, if things were going very bad, prisoners were way out of line, that's when they brought these people in. But much like, I'm willing to bet that was only some of them. I'm willing to bet this was not the majority. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm willing to bet it was not the majority were these sadists, is what Viktor says. I'm willing to bet most of them were this, kind of that apathy phase of a prisoner's mindset, of the apathy phase of the prisoner's journey through camp. The guards were just dulled from camp life. You know, these people are in here experiencing very similar things to the prisoners, right? They're seeing the same stuff. Yeah, their life is better, but they're seeing the same stuff, so they get dulled to it as well. So when they see a beating, they don't cringe at it. That's just every day. You don't cringe at it anymore. You see people die every day. It doesn't bother you anymore. So now when you have to lay a beating, it's not that you'd rather not, but your inner dialogue is not preventing you from it. Not necessarily, I don't know if you follow what I'm saying here. It's not that you can do it. Obviously, I don't know if these guys, like, these people are not the sadists, right? There's a distinction here, but they're going to do it because they're not cringed. They don't cringe to do it. If I'm making sense there. But Viktor talks about how some took pity on the prisoners and some were, like, nice in a way, and it was surprising at times. Viktor talks about how one of them, like, gave him his ration of bread, and it was almost like he was so surprised by it. I'm trying to find it. He gave him more than bread, too, is what Viktor talks about. This is on page 86. He gave him way more than bread. He gave him a human something, which this man also gave to me, the word and the look which accompanied the gift. I'm sure that this group here was hard to come by, but I'm guessing the majority of those guards were this. They were apathetic. They were there for, a paycheck. That's how I would compare this group. You're just there for the paycheck. The paycheck's good enough. It's tolerable enough, so I'll do what I have to do. I don't necessarily want to, but I've got other priorities. That's kind of what I would picture this group being. Let's continue on. 2 races of men. This transcended no matter what race you were, in a sense of, like, skin color. Decent and indecent men were the 2 races. No one race was pure of one. Like Viktor wrote on page 86, no group consisted entirely of decent or indecent people in this sense. No group is of pure race. And then I wrote this quote here. Life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. Damn right. I can only imagine. Right? Again, leading back to what we're talking about, future, time, suffering, opportunity. Life in the concentration camp exposed your soul, and life asked of you, how much suffering can you take? Can you see the opportunity in this? That's what life was asking you. Let's continue. Now he's going to talk about the third stage. Do you remember this? This was early on. This was like first episode. We talked about the 3 stages. First stage was shock. This was stages of the prisoner's mind in camp. First was the shock. The shock came like when you were, on the transport. You still didn't really believe what was happening, and then you got in those lines. They separated you out. You saw your first beatings. You got beat. You got yelled at, and now you're thinking, "Wow, we're not in Kansas anymore." And then apathy takes over. Apathy takes over, and now you get used to all the pain. You get dulled by it. And then the last one is liberation. And this, I can imagine being very, very difficult. And I know what you're thinking, and this is kind of what I thought. Well, you're freed. That's it. The game is over. You win, and you can go back to your life as it was. But for a lot of people, Viktor talks about, they did not know and they could not grasp that they were free. They were told, but you got to understand, some of these people being in this camp for so long, dreaming of the days of their freedom, waking up to camp life for so long, I bet you some of them almost thought that this was a dream. So they did not get their hopes up, thinking that, hey, I'm still going to wake up. I'm still going to wake up. I'm still in the Matrix. So I'm sure that was very hard for people. He talks about like when they ventured out of the camp, they didn't venture out like run out. They were cautious. They accepted cigarettes from the guards. They were wondering what's going on. They found other people, and other people asked them like, well, what do you think? Were you pleased? And they tell them like, truthfully, no. This is on page 88. And what he talks about here is the liberated prisoner going through depersonalization. This is going to be another question. Depersonalization. I spelled that wrong. This is page 88. Depersonalization. What I think happens here, I think I have mentioned this in a previous episode too, about how in Shawshank Redemption there was the guy who had the raven in his jacket. And he gets out of Shawshank, goes back to his regular life, and he ends up killing himself. You become institutionalized, I think is the word that happened, or the word that describes this. I think that's kind of similar to depersonalization, where your identity in a way becomes the camp, even though you don't want it to. Right? You know this life for so long that now when you have the freedom now to get your life back in order the way it was before the camp, you're at a loss on how to do that. You almost have to retrain your brain on your identity and retrain your brain on some other things too that we'll talk about in a second. But you lose your sense of self, because remember what we talked about last time? The goal of the camp probably was to depersonalize you. They wanted everybody thinking the same way, that herd mentality. They didn't want any individualism, right? And just from another perspective, that's probably how revolutions start, when you got one mind speaking against the oppressor majority. They don't want to deal with that. They're trying to make everybody the same. And how do you stand out from that? Well, you retain your values, maintain your eye on the future, and know that the suffering has a purpose. Let's continue. Like I said, liberation came with caution. This was not easy. And Viktor gives this picture of mental pressure. Mental pressure. Kind of like a diver. You're in this caisson diver chamber. You're deep underwater. You have to get acclimated to the pressure of being underwater because there's more pressure from just the water on top of you, atmospheres. So if you come up too soon, it has a tragic consequences for your body because your body's mostly water, blood pumping. It'll mess with you. And there's more technical terms and more science involved in it than I'm describing, but that's kind of the gist of it. If you come up too fast, it's going to harm you. This was one thing that was interesting. Viktor said that since people had endured so much from this camp, and now that they were freed, they thought that they could use their freedom however they wanted. And what he says they ended up becoming was the oppressors themselves. Taking on they were almost no better than the guards that were beating them down in camp. And this word licentiously means like kind of without license. You're throwing caution to the wind. You think you can kind of do whatever you want. It kind of has to do with like promiscuity. So you're kind of just throwing yourself out there without any mind for anybody else. And he talks about walking through these crops on page 90. Him and one of his fellow campers, and how they just walked right through them. And Viktor was trying to tell him, like, hey, let's walk around here. You know, these are crops somebody's grown. This is somebody's food. And the guy tells him, you don't say, and hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and children have been gassed, not to mention everything else, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats. So he didn't like that Viktor said that. And he said that you had to kind of rehab these people. You have to rehab these people from the trauma that they dealt with. The shell shock, the PTSD, really. Like you're a soldier coming back from war. Really, I mean, they were in war. There was two things here and at the bottom of this: bitterness and disillusionment. So what do I mean by this? There were two fundamental experiences which threatened to damage the character of a liberated prisoner: bitterness and disillusionment. Bitterness was when the freed prisoner, people didn't understand what the freed prisoner went through. You know, this is the 40s. No social media, not a ton of news, TVs. I mean, there's just not a lot of media presence as like you see it today. Very different. News does not travel as fast. So when people got out and they would go up to people and say, yeah, I was in a concentration camp, most people I don't think understood what that meant. Or, you know, most people never heard about it. Right? Most people thought that, hey, you were in a concentration camp. Well, it was pretty bad over here too. So the liberated prisoner got a little bitter, like, why don't people care what I went through? And I guarantee you that probably leads you to question, like, man, why did I even get through what I did? To come back to this? You know, you couldn't post anything online. People didn't know. So there was a bitterness to it. There was also a disillusionment that when you got out, things would be better. Things would go back to normal, but they didn't. What they found out was a lot of times, like the people that prisoners were thinking about, their loved ones and stuff in camp, like, hey, once I get freed, I can't wait to see this person. Well, a lot of times nobody was there. And they had to start all over. And their suffering that they experienced in camp does not mean that they will not experience something similar on a different playing field out in the real life. Out in real life. It doesn't stop there. Now you have a new journey of picking up the Lego blocks and starting over where you left off. That was the disillusionment that he was talking about. This was a very interesting concept. What I mean here by reverse is that you spent your whole life in the camp dreaming about the freedom. Then you get liberated. Then you go about your life, family, kids, you retire. And then enough time passes by now where now you're dreaming about the camp experiences, but they're not dreams, they're nightmares. Thought that was a very interesting loop that happens here. In the camp, you're dreaming. Now, probably not a lot of, Viktor did talk about one nightmare, but nothing could compare to the nightmare of the camp. Now you're free. All of a sudden, these camp experiences, instead of giving you some strength, and they probably do after a while, they start to give you nightmares after enough time passes by since you've been there. Viktor writes, as the day of his liberation eventually came, when everything seemed to him like a beautiful dream, so also the day comes when all his camp experiences seem to him nothing but a nightmare. And that's kind of how he ends, page 93. There was also this one, the very last line is, there's nothing he need fear anymore except his God. And with that, we'll end there. Thank you very much if you got through this far. Thank you very much for sticking around and listening. We are going to, for next week, read. This is starting on page 97, and we will read 20 pages. So 97 to, 117? Through 117. We'll read for next time. So that's page 97, this is the start of chapter 2, Logotherapy in a Nutshell. Page 97 to 117 for next time, for next week. And then also think about these discussion questions. I will post these in the description of the video. Thank you all very much for listening. My name is Chris Lazar. This is Chee-Tash. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.